Yeah, if anybody's having any issues, here's a number to call in if you're having any audio issues, or feel free to use the chat function to let us know what's going on. In terms of the presentation, if you have any questions, we're going to hold them all until the end, but try and use the Q&A button instead of the chat question so we can have those all listed together, and we'll go through them at the end of the presentation. Yeah, we'll give it about 2 more minutes before we get started. So if everybody can just hold tight. Looks like we still got a few people drifting in. All right, we will give 1 more minute to 6:03, and then we'll get underway. Again, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. If you have any questions that you want us to answer, please use the Q&A function, and we will answer those at the end of the meeting. And if you have any issues or anything, you can use the chat function, and Rachel can respond kind of during the presentation. But any major questions you want us to respond to at the end, please use the Q&A. And I guess with that, we will go ahead and get started. We're here tonight to talk about e-mobility, electric bikes, scooters, and other personal mobility devices in trails and parks in Arvada. And this meeting tonight is specifically to talk about the results of the public outreach that we did last year, and then our policy steps and the feedback we got from City Council. So an overview, we'll introduce the project team, talk about the background, the engagement process, and then the results, the policy options and recommendations that were presented to City Council, their feedback, and then what our next steps in our decision making is. So if you're new to this process, my name is Adam Lind. I'm the Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator for the City of Arvada, and with us tonight is Emily Sexton, who is the Parks and Urban Design Manager, and we will be your presenters tonight. So just to kind of start from the beginning here, the Public Works Department for the city was evaluating whether or not to bring micromobility, scooter, and e-bike rental companies to Arvada. So Jump, Bird, Lime, some of those types of companies. The city's transportation committee had recommended to initiate a pilot project within 1 mile of the G-Line stations. And kind of before we were able to go any further with that process, we realized we needed to determine whether or not e-bikes and scooters would be allowed on trails, initially within that 1 mile radius, but then without the city. So just to clarify, tonight we're not talking about these rental devices. What we're talking about is any general, and at this time, your personal owned e-bike, scooter, electric skateboard, whatever kind of personal device you have. If the city does decide to explore the micromobility and rental mobility companies in the future, there'll be a separate public engagement process from that this kind of forms the basis of. And for the city, there isn't really a clearly defined policy for e-bikes and scooters. The 2016 Parks, Trails, and Open Space Master Plan recommends that we take this step to explore what our policy should be. So as I mentioned, there isn't anything specifically that says these devices are allowed or not allowed, or where the cutoff is. And so what we're looking at is an amendment or an ordinance update that would or would not allow these devices on off-street trails, in parks and open spaces within the city, and then to help define which devices are actually allowed within the city. And to touch base on a little bit of the legal background here, the state of Colorado, the legislature recently passed a law allowing e-bikes to be used within the city, and then kind of local jurisdictions can add on to these rules and restrict them further. So if you hear us talking about different classes of e-bikes, we wanted to clarify what that means. So a class 1 e-bike is assistance only when the rider is pedaling and cuts off at 20 miles an hour. Class 2 e-bikes both can provide extra assistance when pedaling and via throttle and ceases at 20 miles an hour. And then class 3 is assistance when the rider is pedaling and ceases at 28 miles an hour. So the distinction here is that class 1 and 2, the ones that cut off at 20 miles an hour, can be ridden on bike lanes, trails, or multi-use paths. But that class 3 e-bike that has the higher speed is not allowed on any trails and can only be ridden on the road, and helmets are required for riders under 18, between 16 and 18. So what we're really discussing here tonight is whether or not to allow those class 1 or class 2 e-bikes on trails. And with that, I will turn it over to Emily Sexton.
Thanks, Adam. So next we wanted to talk about the public engagement process that we've gone through thus far. So here you can see a timeline diagram. We held our first public meeting. So tonight's meeting is the second in our public engagement process, but our first meeting was held on September 10th. And then from that point forward until the end of September, we started an in-person and online survey process. So we did have people actually out on a trail surveying, and then we also had online surveys available through our Speak Up Arvada platform online. We ended any public comment on September 21st. I believe that the surveys opened near the end of August. So we had about a 1 month period where people could provide input and feedback and comments. And then more recently here at the beginning of January, Adam and I took all that information that we received from the public, their feedback, and presented that to City Council via one of their workshop meetings. And then that brings us till tonight. You can see here on the diagram, February 2021, in which we are doing our second public meeting. So similarly to how we presented at City Council, we wanted to present what feedback we got from the public, and then share with you next steps. So the final part of this public engagement and process is to bring our recommendations back to City Council at one of their business meetings for them to take the policy change to a vote. And we're hoping to target that sometime in summer 2021. Next slide, please. So before I get into the actual questions that were asked in the surveys, I just wanted to kind of set the scene of how many surveys we received. As I mentioned, we had surveys open for about a month. You can see here there were 8 different in-person survey locations from riders, not just Arvada residents, but from all over Jefferson County or whoever's was using those paths on those days. And you can see that in-person surveys, we received about 112, and then online surveys, we received 191, bringing the survey total to about 303 responses. Next slide, please. This is a quick map showing the locations of those in-person surveys. This was, the locations were selected by our Arvada Parks Advisory Committee. So, you know, they did a great job figuring out which paths were highly used and on which days were good for us to survey in person. Next slide. And then finally, we're going to get into the actual content of the surveys. So in the surveys that were filled out, we found that the demographics of the people who were responding and filling out surveys were from several different zip codes. The majority here in blue, you can see, were from Arvada. Others were just from, maybe unincorporated Jefferson County or nearby cities in Colorado. There were a few riders on trails that were from out of state, and then a handful didn't want to answer. There are 24 people didn't want to answer in purple. Next slide. From an age standpoint, you can see here in green, the majority, green and purple actually, the majority of survey respondents were above the age of 50. And then as you go down the line, the younger and younger you get, the less responses we received. Next slide. So the first question that we asked was, what is your level of support for electric bicycles on paved trails in parks and open spaces in Arvada? And you can see we gave 5 different options for people taking the survey to respond. And on the top here, you can see 70 respondents strongly opposed e-bikes, 25 opposed, 34 were neutral, 49 supported, and 124 strongly supported. So next slide, please. With the majority in support, but there was some opposition. The next question we asked was, well, what's your reasoning for your level of support? Why you support or why you're against? From a support standpoint, the top things that people responded was that they think it's important for access and equity. Everyone with different abilities. Some people have injuries and required e-bikes to be on trails. So that's why they're in support. Some people think it's a really great mode of transportation. Some survey respondents rely on e-bikes for their mode of transportation to and from work. Some thought it was better for the environment. It's electric powered. They're not, someone riding their bike isn't taking a car. It's safer than riding on the road. So it's safer riding through parks. And then also it's great for health and exercise. I'm not going to go through these here, but you can read some of the other responses that we got. I will mention that for both e-bikes and e-scooters, we got several responses that mentioned that they own one. So they were obviously in support. From an opposition standpoint, excuse me, the overwhelming reasoning was that there's a perception or belief that they're unsafe. They create conflict. They ride too fast on the trails. Many people thought that there needs to be some sort of speed regulation, and that also adding e-bikes to our trails creates more crowded trails. And then finally, with neutral, people who selected neutral just don't care. They've never encountered e-bikes to their knowledge, or created trail damage, which isn't necessarily applicable here because we're only proposing allowing e-bikes on paved trails. And our trails are rated for vehicles, actual truck vehicles to ride on our trails for maintenance. Next slide, please. So based on the reasoning that we got, we wanted to kind of test and see, out of the people who thought that they were unsafe or they created conflict, how many of those people have actually experienced a conflict with e-bikes personally? And so here on the right, you can see the pie chart shows that 92.5% of responses found that they have not had a personal conflict. Out of those who have, their reasoning for personal conflicts was that the bikers or e-bikers didn't have etiquette. There was a near collision, or it seemed that the rider had no control. They were going too fast, as I already mentioned. And then also it was mentioned that because they're quiet, they would spook a horse, which makes a lot of sense. Next slide, please. And actually, I'll mention if you can go back. So the data in this survey, what it tells us is that although there might be a perception that e-bikes are unsafe, there was, we actually got no responses where someone had actually had a collision, had an injury, had something happen to them where they were, seriously hurt or had a personal conflict. Next slide, please. So we did the exact same thing, and I'll go through these slides a bit faster, but we did the same thing for e-scooters. So what is your level of support for electric scooters on paved trails and parks and open space? And you can see here that there is definitely a little bit different of a balance. I would say that the responses are a little bit more balanced, leaning on the side of opposition for electric scooters. Next slide. And the reasoning for these responses, a lot of the same ones that I mentioned before, so I won't repeat them, but some of the different ones that we received from the support angle was that that e-scooters could bring tourism to Arvada, and also that they were safer than e-bikes or something that's heavier, just because they're lighter, and they riders, because they don't have quite as much control, can't go as fast, therefore not being quite as dangerous. On the opposition side, you have countering opinions there, still unsafe, no control. We got a little bit more responses here that riders are lazy, and also responses that e-scooters are typically ridden by kids, so it's more reckless riders. And then the same responses from a neutral standpoint. Next slide. And then we asked the same question about, have you actually had personal conflicts with an e-scooter? Very similar responses again. The majority here in yellow, you can see they have not had a personal conflict with an e-scooter that, makes us think, well, maybe it's more of a perception thing. Maybe it's something where we need public education, not just for those who are writing about etiquette, but also those who are experiencing the trails for all riders, not just e-bikes, e-scooters, riders in general. So I think that the responses here for personal conflicts people did note are pretty much the same as e-bikes: near collision, no control, little etiquette, things of those natures. Next slide, please. And then the last question that we asked was a couple questions, was if you could prohibit other vehicles from being ridden on our trails, what would those vehicles be? Some people just didn't want any motorized vehicles whatsoever. Other highlights that to note were hoverboards, motorcycles, and mopeds, which is not something that we would consider because they're a gas vehicle and are more loud. Golf carts, which again isn't something that we're proposing to allow, as well as ATVs. From vehicles to allow, folks had noted that they would like disability vehicles to be allowed. That's not something that we would ever consider prohibiting on the trails. We of course support vehicles that help the disabled, whether it's injury or a physical disability. Devices under 10 to 15 miles per hour. We did have folks who were passionate about electric boards. Some wanted class 3 bikes allowed on our trails, which, as Adam mentioned, that's not something that we're proposing during part of this effort. And then some said all devices should be allowed. And then with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Adam to talk about the policies that we recommended to City Council.
Thanks, Emily. So we presented pretty much the same presentation to City Council, and then kind of opened up the floor for their discussion with a few different policy options and allowing them to combine things however they thought, to allow class 1 and class 2 e-bikes, allow e-scooters, allow small personal electric devices, or do not allow any electric devices on trails. And so that was kind of our policy options that we presented to council. And in addition, something somewhat related to e-bikes, but just in general, to improve trail etiquette and behavior and comfort on the trails. Long-term looking into widening trails that are crowded and highly used, initiate a trail etiquette campaign, enforcement, whether that's through a trail ranger program or speed limit signs, radar signs along trails, which council wasn't too supportive of, and a public education program. So we'll be working both between Public Works and the Parks Department to initiate some of these policies moving forward. And so with that, City Council had a pretty long discussion that was very supportive of allowing e-bikes and scooters and small personal mobility devices on our trails in the city for a variety of reasons that were presented both by the public and based on their own thoughts. So that is the policy that we are planning to move forward with. Our next steps are to update a variety of city ordinances that need to be updated to allow these devices to operate within the city and on parks and trails. Finalize the description of the devices that will and will not be allowed on trails in Arvada. As Emily mentioned, we're not getting into allowing golf carts, ATVs, anything that's gas powered. We are trying to keep it, small to a bicycle, skateboard, scooter size, but we do want to shape the ordinance so that if something new comes out, we don't have to update the ordinance, but it will be limited by size, speed, weight, kind of those elements, so that anything that fits in underneath, we wouldn't have to update the ordinance in the future. And so we'll be working over the next few months to update the ordinances and get everything organized. And then we will be presenting that to City Council for a public hearing, which will be another opportunity for you, the public, to weigh in on this process and making it before making any final decisions. So with that wraps up our presentation, and I will turn off the screen sharing and we'll open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple questions. First, I just want to say that there's a question about this. The presentation has been recorded, and in a few days, it'll be available on our Speak Up page and arvada.org for you to review. What another question was consideration given to e-bikes on city sidewalks?
Not specifically with this effort, but part of our policy and ordinance update does get into that. And it's a little complicated, but currently scooters are categorized as toy vehicles, which means they're not allowed in the roadway, but they are allowed on sidewalks by the state. And then right now the city kind of doesn't have a policy to allow them in parks. So theoretically, you could use your scooter on a sidewalk and that's it. So in the city of Arvada, bicycles are allowed to ride on sidewalks anywhere that they're not prohibited. So if you're not comfortable biking on the road, you could use your bike on the sidewalk outside of Old Town or currently on Ralston Road. So hopefully that answers that question.
How much will it cost to put up signs and speed limit signs, like etiquette signs and speed limit signs?
That's not something that we've necessarily analyzed yet. We haven't analyzed the costs of public etiquette signage programs or education programs at this point. We're hoping it's something that we can work with our Arvada Parks Advisory Committee to come up and with brainstorm ideas where there might be some cost-effective ways, but at this point, we don't have any cost estimates to share.
Should one policy option involve safer streets, such as parking protected bike lanes, so bicycle users have better options that don't involve using trails?
That is something that the city is working on kind of independently from this. To point out, the project on West 72nd Avenue that the city has is going to include separated bike lanes, and we're working on a second project along West 60th Avenue that's for separated bike lanes. So the city does have a bicycle master plan that was adopted by council in 2017. That's kind of guiding our on-street development of safer bike infrastructure, but that is a kind of a long-term 50-year master plan. Whereas, in the city, we do have this great network of trails that we want to make available and that most people are choosing to use anyways and are comfort to using. But yeah, the goal is to have safer streets to complement our safe trail network.
A suggestion. I'm going to read the comment. I feel that your information is not accurate by people saying they have not had a run-in with these electric vehicles because they are not allowed. I would like to see a survey a year from when you changed the ordinance to see how many people might have had run-ins. Do you have a plan for follow-up? This is my question. Do you have a plan for follow-up surveying or testing after an ordinance is changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea and definitely something we can do and plan to do. Just implementing a policy and updating it isn't kind of the end of the line. We want to make sure that what's happening is not causing a detriment to residents, visitors, park users for their experience. And so if something, if we are noticing major issues, then it's within our right and our abilities to go back and revisit this policy. So yeah, I think it's a great idea that we can definitely do a similar study or the same study at the same locations to have comparable data.
If these changes are made, will Arvada's park e-mobility program be more like our neighbors and more like Jefferson County?
Do you want to answer that, Emily?
Yeah, so we did, before starting this process, we did reach out to Jefferson County to understand what their ordinances were like. They did a similar survey that ours was somewhat modeled off of. It deviated a little bit, but for the most part, yes, we're still working with legal to really understand our ordinances and how to make those. It gets a little bit complicated with just making sure that we clearly define what vehicles are allowed and which ones aren't. I don't believe that Jefferson County acknowledges or necessarily has a clearly defined policy about e-scooters or smaller devices, to my knowledge. So ours will deviate in that way, but from an e-bike standpoint, we will be following what Jefferson County has adopted.
Right, and part of the goal here is, so if you were on your bike and biking along Clear Creek west into Jeffco or east into Adams County in Denver, that all of our policies are aligned and you're not technically breaking any rules by using your e-bike or scooter along the trail.
Is there a plan to keep horses and equestrian users safe?
I think a lot of that has to do with the etiquette and educational piece, for horse riders and for electric bike users, just making sure that if you are riding a quiet e-bike, that, maybe it's something where we have a marketing campaign where we hand out bells so that, more bike riders, whether they're electric or not, let pedestrians or horses know when bikers are passing, so as not to spook the animals.
Anything long-term that travels north-south? I'm not sure I understand the question, but.
I think it's infrastructure based. So we do have a variety of projects going on right now. Some along Alkire Street, trail development along Indiana. Emily, maybe you can weigh in as well. I think we're working on some Lighting Creek future improvements to continue that trail going north-south. But if you want to reach out to myself or Emily offline after this meeting, we can kind of give you some more details and have a specific discussion about trail infrastructure.
Yeah, and we do have, I believe there's a I can't talk, a bike master plan, as well as the parks open space and trails master plan from 2016 clearly defines where our trail gaps are and what we're prioritizing in terms of making those connections. So I know that there are trails that make those north-south connections. We just haven't gotten to them yet, but it's definitely on our radar.
David asks, what is a separated bike lane? Is there a barrier between the cyclist and motorized traffic?
Yeah, so a separated bike lane is more or less that has vertical and horizontal separation between drivers and the bike lane. So instead of just a white stripe, there could be flex posts, there could be concrete curbs, there can be planters. On West 72nd, it's going to be kind of behind the curb, so we'll have a nice 7-foot buffer with trees planted and then a bike lane and then like a wide sidewalk next to that. So it's kind of the Cadillac of safety and design, separating all the users to the maximum ability.
Another question is asking to clarify, will this allow companies like Lime to operate?
No, this doesn't touch that world yet. This is just allowing any and all e-bikes or scooters that you own at this time. In the future, it does set the stage that the city could create a new policy with a new ordinance and take some additional steps to allow those rental devices, but this won't allow those to start operating in the city without any future ordinance updates.
I'm going to move to the chat and see if there's any questions there. Does multi-use and pedestrian path include all city sidewalks, or is it only some of them?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, where a bike is not allowed is the only place that you can't ride it. So same with scooters. So like pretty much just in Old Town is the only place that riding bikes on sidewalks is not allowed within the city.
I'm reading comments, but looking for questions. So we have some, well, I'll share these, the team will get these, but let's see. There's a conversation in the chat about conflict between different types of users and, perceived poor etiquette from, if you're a pedestrian, sometimes the cyclists you see as having poor etiquette. When you're a cyclist, you see pedestrians and dog walkers with long leashes as having poor etiquette. So do you guys want to talk a little bit maybe about any ideas about an etiquette campaign to help with signage on our, like just generally on Arvada trails?
Yeah, I think one of the first steps is figuring out what all of the etiquette issues are. So those that you mentioned, and then I'm sure there's some that we haven't thought about. We're still at the kind of the beginning stages of approaching that. So it's hard for me to speak detailed about that at this point. But I mean, I think that is one of the first and foremost things, especially in the survey that we just got. Most of the responses did revolve around etiquette. So that's definitely something that we've heard from the residents and that we now need to plan for the future of how we move forward with that.
So there's a question, just to clarify, class 3 e-bikes are not allowed.
Not allowed on
that's not the, okay.
Trails, sidewalks. The only place they're allowed is on the road, like a car.
Okay, thank you. And is there a date established yet for considering shared e-bikes and e-scooters?
No, at this time we haven't really got back into that. It is something that internally we're planning to discuss this year to see if it makes sense still. Our original plan was that it would function around the 1 mile radius around the G line stations to kind of serve as connection service. But now with the pandemic and changing commuting patterns, I think it's something that we need to review and reassess and see if it still makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, see one more question in the chat. Will you be posting signs on unpaved trails to explain that e-bikes are not allowed there?
Probably. Again, we haven't come up with a signage plan and really gotten into the weeds with what signs are going and how we're going to adjust our existing signs. But that is a concern of many people using single track trails or dirt trails, and so that's something that we'll have to consider and figure out how to adjust existing signs to reflect that.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. Oh, one more. So we have a commenter who's saying It's important to talk about collisions between cars and bicycles and pedestrians. And they were recently hit by a car and is altering all of his routes to involve trails. Adam, do you want to like kind of talk generally about some projects that are looking to improve safety? And you mentioned West 72nd Avenue. Is there anything else that people can get involved in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, always a serious issue and always a serious concern for everybody, whether you're using the trails. I mean, at some point, you're kind of always in that realm of crossing the street. So we do have small amounts of funding that we're looking to improve trail crossings. Jefferson County Open Space has some new grants going out, and we're starting to coordinate with them to see if there's options for trail crossing improvements. We've done some minor improvements along Ward Road. So if anybody has suggestions, you're always invited to send those in. But the city is aware of that, and kind of parallel to this, or not parallel, but at the same time, we're working on a new traffic calming program for the city. If any of you were involved in the West 57th study, we looked at how to improve bicycle safety by adding separated bike lanes and looking at traffic circles, speed humps, raised crosswalks, things like that to improve the safety for people crossing the street, but as well as kind of limit the ability of drivers to speed above the speed limit. And so we're starting that program, and we'll be looking at ways to expand it and take on to start new efforts in the next year. So that is a little bit of what we're doing.
Great, thank you. So with that, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the question and answer session, the recording will be posted on Speak Up on the Speak Up Arvada page on arvada.org, and then it's also will be on our YouTube channel in a few days. One more question slipped in. The question is, there are no e-bikes allowed on gravel paths at all, like around Table Mountain?
So my understanding Table Mountain, I believe is unincorporated Jefferson County. I believe that's a Jefferson County park. I could be mistaken, but following the Jefferson County laws and rules, no. So you can, another resource you can go to is just type in your browser e-bikes Jefferson County, and they have their whole webpage that kind of lays out what's allowed and what's not allowed in their parks. And my understanding is that they do not allow it on their dirt trails.
Thank you, Emily. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Appreciate your comments, and stay involved as we move this process forward and take it to our final ordinances to City Council. So that's like I mentioned, that's one last time where you can weigh in for or against and let City Council hear your opinion and your voice. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.